So, as we look back at the first year of this much vaunted and anticipated Trump 2.0 GOP trifecta, that this was supposed to be our revenge, drain the swamp, fight the weaponization. If there's one thing that we knew that was supposed to be true, it was that the FBI as we know it, or as we knew it, would be gone. There was a broad consensus on the right that the FBI was systemically broken in terms of the personnel at all levels, in terms of its modus operandi and its incentives and workflow, in terms of prioritizing quantity of cases over quality, missing real threats, of which there's many. We see Islamic and communist and Antifa, while instead focusing their efforts where there aren't threats and actually violating civil rights of Americans, a surveillance state, the tyranny. We were supposed to get to the bottom of January 6th, Arctic frost, everything that was done under Biden to basically weaponize the government against political opposition, persecutions. And it was supposed to be drained. It was supposed to be slimmed back. There was a broad consensus, if not to abolish it completely, but certainly to limit its purview to just maybe a few things like, international human trafficking, sex trafficking. And here we are a year later, and it's meet the boss, same as the old boss. Now, folks, I would submit to you that I think we all knew, as it related to economy, as it related honestly to a lot of the immigration stuff, they would say, well, we don't have the votes and no one wants to cut spending or whatever. And that was never going to happen. But it was clear that, let me tell you, I just get in there executively. This is my personnel. We're certainly going to drain these people, put in our people, defang the FBI of its ability to ever impose that just draconian banana republic style tyranny we saw under Biden. And as long as it's around, obviously use it as a force for good. So where do things stand a year later? If you look with a microscope, could you even tell a difference with their incompetence? I mean, one thing that's the hallmark of 2025 is that we have had a torrent of successful and attempted both Islamic and left wing terror attacks, assassinations. Um, do you feel safer that the FBI is totally on the case of the Palestinian movement, the transgenderism movement, the obviously Antifa, these John Brown gun clubs? No, I mean, and we see that they couldn't even catch the Brown University shooter, and honestly probably wouldn't have gotten Charlie Kirk's assassin if not for anomalous circumstances of the father being a sheriff's deputy turning him in. So where are we? Where are we? Well, what I can tell you is a lot of the people that perpetrated that rise of the Fourth Reich, they're still there, both at FBI, DOJ, U.S. attorneys' offices. They haven't even been fired. And in fact, they're the ones firing everyone else. And then the very whistleblowers, like our next guest, who actually brought to life the fact that government was surveilling Republican politicians, Arctic frost, all this stuff. Well, they actually were either never rehired or rehired just to be fired. And it's like, this is like the Twilight Zone. Again, this is not the 60 vote threshold. This is not the narrow majority in the House. This is not the federal judge. This is done by the personnel at FBI and DOJ in this administration. So what is the story with the FBI and DOJ? So with us is the most qualified person to discuss this, who's really been a victim of this all along, Steve Friend, who's one of the original FBI whistleblowers, who was fired, then hired, then refired last week. You can follow him at Real Steve Friend on Twitter. Very importantly, check out his twice weekly podcast, the American Radicals podcast on Rumble, and he's with us today. Hey, Steve, welcome back here again. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year's.
Thanks for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of point this stuff out in light of the fact that I've now been summarily dismissed under 2 different FBIs. I think I am probably more qualified than most to comment on how Meet the New Boss, same as the old boss, is pretty much status quo.
So maybe we'll start off with your situation, because I think the juxtaposition of so many of the bad actor career employees that were involved in all of the things we yelped about, whether it was going after, political organizations, going after, the whole J6 stuff, Arctic Frost, all these guys are still there, but you are not. Why are you? So it took almost all year to get you hired. Then we heard you were hired, so I kind of dropped the story. And then I saw last week you were fired. What's the story?
Well, there was a deal put into place without actually consulting with any of the whistleblowers. There was 10 of us, and the FBI was so thirsty for a PR victory over the summer that they preemptively announced, the director, Kash Patel, announced that there was a deal in place to reinstate 10 FBI whistleblowers who had been removed from duty. That happened in August. August 26th was the actual day we signed the settlement. Unfortunately for Patel, he announced a couple days prior, and then promptly he was told to leave the country and go to Scotland on vacation so that they could remove him from the situation. Now, we signed the deal. It was supposed to be a 30-day agreement, every amount of time between signing it and then being reinstated, receiving all back pay, medical insurance, put to positions that were commensurate with where we had been prior. And now we sit, and it's 114 days later, and none of those have actually been met for just about every single one of us. I believe only 1 or 2 of the whistleblowers were returned to duty. Still no back pay, still medical insurance is a question, and the rest of us were sitting on the sidelines. Now, I considered myself to be not an employee of the FBI, having not had any contact with them, not having credentials, a badge, a gun, a duty, medical insurance, chain of command, vehicle, all of that, email address, security clearance. That was another thing that was supposed to be insured to us. And then lo and behold, was contacted at 5 o'clock at night on a Sunday and told that I needed to report to duty the following day, December 8th. Came in, was unable to do anything. They couldn't even issue me a firearm because my security clearance wasn't in effect. And then at the end of the week, was called back in on a Saturday when there was no regular business hours so that I could be summarily dismissed for comments that I made that were critical of the FBI. So essentially doing what I had done prior, which is the ultimate sin in the FBI, and that is pointing out their shortcomings, essentially embarrassing the FBI. So now 2 different directors, 2 different attorney generals, 2 different presidents, the same old FBI.
So I'm a little confused. You were rehired, but without a security clearance, without pay, but told to report to duty. How many days did that take place, and what were you doing during the time?
So I was rehired on a Monday. I live in Daytona Beach, was told to report to Jacksonville, was transported there by another agent. They issued me credentials and badge, but no gun because I didn't have a clearance, which means I can't be in the facility unaccompanied. So essentially escorted everywhere. No access to computer systems, no cell phone. They gave me a vehicle with police lights and radio that I couldn't use for my duties, and was told that I couldn't even fill up gas with the card because they couldn't issue me a card to do that. So I was going to have to drive 180 miles round trip to get gas for that vehicle. So one day in Jacksonville on Monday, following day, again, back to Jacksonville. Wednesday, had a 1-hour meeting in Daytona Beach with an assistant special agent in charge, and during which time I was told I had over 400 hours of vacation time, and they suggested I liberally use it because it was use or lose hours within the next 12 months. So took the next 2 days off, and was out of town when I received a call Friday evening that I had to imminently return to the office to sign some very important, crucial paperwork. I wasn't able to do that because I wasn't local. And an hour later, got a text message from a reporter from the New York Post saying that there was reporting that I was about to be terminated, which means that the FBI was planning on terminating me on Friday, was unable to do that, and leaked it to the press that their intentions were that. So it was a humiliation ritual. They wanted to do that to me in the office, and then also publicly besmirch my reputation, very much like what happened the day before I testified to Congress, May of 2023, when the FBI revoked my security clearance and leaked that to the press. So was called in on Saturday. So I guess you give me 6 days of credit, and met with 2 of the suits, and they gave me some summary dismissal letter from the director of the FBI, not even from Human Resources. Kash Patel signed it himself.
So I'm looking at this, and some might say, well, you were criticizing the FBI, so obviously they had to let you go. But the problem with that is that from the get-go, it was clear they weren't going to issue you a security clearance. They weren't going to give you any duty, and they said, just take vacation. And then from the fact that, like you said, the other whistleblowers also none of them have been fully restated with all of the promises. Most have not been restated. So this is not just, okay, unique comment or circumstance. Clearly, they don't want the whistleblowers there. So this is a good time, I think, to lead into the subject matter from your particular experience. So you would think we all had this view that the FBI needs to be reformed. So there's a group of you that continue to have that belief, believe it or not, after January 20th, kind of like on some other policy issues. But so you would think that view would be welcomed. Hey, Steve, what are your ideas for reforming field offices? The type of cases they take up, how they, how they investigate, this whole, informant program, the entrapment stuff. All of your ideas, you would think you'd be brought in, but instead it's almost like, actually, we're happy with the way it's been operating under Biden, and we're pissed off that you're saying what they were all saying all along, including those that are leading the FBI that were lodging the same complaints under Biden, but now they're bothered by you taking that same position.
I think they're offended by my consistency on this. It's almost there's a dual track here. The director of the FBI contacted a number of the whistleblowers, myself included, and asked for assistance during the transition. We prepared a full PowerPoint slide deck for him on potential reforms, personnel advice. These are the things that he actually testified that didn't go on when he was confirmed. So he might have a perjury concern there. And he attained that office and then promptly stopped communicating with us entirely. And we weren't in search of positions. We didn't even want to claim or credit. We just wanted to be a resource for him to bring about what he promised to do, and that was to de-weaponize the institution. Similarly, you have the co-deputy director, Bongino, who was named and actually reached out to me in earnest and said that he wanted me to help him and be a member of his staff because he did not trust the people that are in there, things that he said on his podcast, total personnel warfare. And then got into the position there and right away seemed to break off communications, and apparently was communicating with members of Congress that I had character issues that were in the personnel files that were turned over to me, and don't say anything about having character issues. So we've got a co-opting of both of those men at the helm. And there's an effort afoot for the last since February is when Patel took over. So you're talking 10, 11 months to ensure that the FBI remains as this institution. They're failing to bring about the changes that they wanted at a personnel level, at a policy level, at a prosecution level. And I do have my problems with even the prosecutions because I am a zealot against weaponized government. And it doesn't matter who is in a position of authority. It doesn't matter if it's your guys or it's our guys. If you have this attack dog, that apparatchik exists so that a time will come when a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph has it at its fingertips. The prime directive for those guys, and they assured me in the beginning and now seem to forgot, was that we had to take the teeth out of that attack dog. That was paramount, and it hasn't happened.
No, for sure. We were talking about, okay, you're a force multiplier for an investigative tools, maybe for local law enforcement, but that you wouldn't be able to come in and just be turned loose on political opponents. Obviously, that hasn't changed. Now, the source of that is really personnel. Look, objectively, obviously, you're a friend of mine, but let's say I didn't know anything. And look, we want to change things, but you got to change it with the right people. There are a lot of loose cannons, there's gripers, there's all sorts of things. So maybe people don't know you. They say maybe you do have character issues. Maybe there's something wrong with you. But that would be more believable if they actually change the FBI, but they just didn't want you as a part of it. But could you give us a sampling of the sorts of people who remain in the FBI involved in the Mar-a-Lago raid, involved in Arctic Frost, involved in J6? How much of that has changed?
Well, we can just pull the opening communication of the Arctic Frost investigation that was turned over and made transparent in this age of transparency. That's their favorite word. And you will see the redactions on the opening document. There are 6 names because those individuals are still at the FBI. And you can go over to Stephen Jensen, who was promoted by Kash Patel and then touted when he and Bongino did an interview with Maria Bartiromo that man did literally what he was asked to do. He just followed orders. So they made him the assistant director in charge of the Washington field office. He was the architect of the January 6th investigations. And then when they took the PR heat, they wound up summarily dismissing him. So there's now a pending lawsuit for that. And similarly, you had an individual who was tied to the Mar-a-Lago search warrant, who was all of a sudden the private pilot for the director on his Gulfstream jet without his knowledge. And then when that came to his awareness, he ordered Brian Driscoll, who had been the acting director of the FBI before Patel got there, to fire that man. And Brian Driscoll, to his credit, said, I can't fire him for doing his job. And both of them were dismissed. So it's this very reactionary personnel thing that's going on here. And a little bit more salacious is the individuals who were the BLM kneelers, the Kneel Team 6. They were fired 5 years after they committed the infraction. We had another a staffer who became an agent who hung a pride flag in Los Angeles years prior and was at the academy in process of becoming an agent. He was just fired for those sorts of things. Now, look, those are unprofessional, but I think that there's a certain statute of limitations on those matters, and they've gone about really touting these removals, but at the same time, they're going to lose all of those lawsuits. They're completely inappropriate. And at the same time, the senior executive service members, those are people no longer on the GS pay scale. They're at the special agent in charge of the field office, assistant directors, executive assistant directors, deputy directors, all of those. Those are the people that are at the upper echelons, the 7th floor of the Hoover building. They are still in place. And those are the people who Dan Bongino says that he's meeting with every single day, and they're putting 100 level 10 things on his desk and calling meetings and distracting him from doing what you would want the deputy director to do, and that is to bring about the change, the vision that the director laid out in his plethora of media interviews that we had to de-weaponize the FBI.
So in other words, your biggest criticism, if I get this right, last year and subsequently, it was, yeah, obviously they were being turned loose on us under a Democrat president, but systemically there was a problem with the ethos of the FBI that their purview is potentially everything under the sun. So they have metrics of cases, arrests, rather than in totality saying, okay, what are the greatest national threats to America that we are the most equipped in dealing with that maybe local law enforcement is not, and let's deal with that, whether it's Antifa, whether it's Islamic terror, whatever it is, and let's do that really well. Instead, it's just everything under the sun that they grab from local law enforcement. Has there been any change in terms of the matrix of the anarcho-tyranny, what they inappropriately focus on versus what they appropriately should focus on? Has any of that changed, or has it given you confidence over the last 11 months that it's headed on a positive trajectory?
I think it's actually gone the exact opposite. I think it's devolved even further because
Whoa.
they're able to use terminology that is innocuous. It sounds nefarious, overly broad. The devolution of the national security mission, going from looking for legitimate terrorists overseas to homegrown violent extremists to domestic violent extremists to anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists, which was big under the Biden administration. Those are people who had a perception of government overreach. That was the definition of that. And you can open up an investigation on any of those people, not with an allegation of a crime, but just an articulable purpose. Just have a feeling about that person. And now we have the further devolution, which is the nihilistic violent extremists that they're hyping, and they're touting how they've opened up 500% new cases. And they're trying to jam these square pegs into round holes and attach it to child's exploitation so that the American people are saying, well, I don't care what you call them. We want to go after the pedophiles. That's fine by me. But A nihilist is someone who really doesn't have an ideology at all. So now we're making the FBI the arbiter of not just right think and wrong think, but no think at all. And they're doing the bidding of the status quo. Whoever is in charge, they're going to dutifully go after the people, not necessarily the bad actors, the really high profile, complex investigations that you would need an $11 billion agency to do. They go for the low hanging fruit because they have to get those press releases out there because they're so thirsty for dad's approval. The president has to make sure that he's giving his stamp of approval to them so they can tell America that they're doing such a great job so that their brand will be elevated. You have Kash Patel, who has his personal publicist. He's made her a special government employee. You have Dan Bongino about to exit there. He wants to go back to that podcast, make sure the thralls of the audience are there for him, and he has to be a conquering hero. And that's why they recently announced in an emergency situation of this Brown failure that they had a big terrorist takedown out in Los Angeles. And it was this Turtle Island Liberation Front. I mean, try to say that without laughing. And it was the typical playbook that the FBI loves to run. They have them going all the time where they find low intelligence people, vulnerable people down on their luck. They introduce an informant and then they introduce an undercover and then they encourage them to do their worst ideas. And then they spring the mousetrap and get the headline and hope that Americans don't actually read the documents that are attached to it and realize that those people were never predisposed or even likely to commit any sort of act of terrorism, but for the involvement of the FBI. Meanwhile, the opportunity cost of actual threats out there, those are just too hard and too complicated. We'll just let those go.
So that latter thing is very jarring to me. I think it's become abundantly clear to any honest voice in the so-called conservative industry, conservative space, that, look, Democrats win, which they likely will. They're going to pick up where they left. I mean, nothing has been defanged. Nothing has been set back even 5 yards. They're going to pick up from a scoring position, and they'll use that machinery against us. But what's jarring is that even now, where it's not been slimmed down in terms of budget and purview and modus operandi, we've actually had terrible, terrible threats to this country, more so than the previous year. So you've had, we had 2 deadly Palestinian attacks in Boulder, Colorado, the Israeli embassy workers. We've had a number of deadly attacks on ICE, which is a ubiquitous problem. What's the FBI doing on that front?
I can't tell anything that I've seen. I mean, they seem to be looking for the low-hanging fruit, trying to get the high-profile cases, or at least promising results on these salacious cases and never actually delivering them. Things like Epstein and cocaine in the White House and the Dobbs leak, which isn't illegal at all. And look, I think that the bureaucracy is actually getting what it wants out of this. And this, I don't know if you're even aware of this, Daniel, but the funding here is a big deal. Now, we had the executive order from the president that is declaring Antifa a domestic terrorist organization. That sounds good and to people who are worried about their public safety and security of the country. But there's a funding mechanism here that the FBI has been fighting for a very long time, because the FBI gets $11 billion into its general funds, its coffers. However, the counterterrorism mission gets funding from an external bucket of funds. They've not been able to use those external funds for anything related to domestic terrorism. Those all go towards international terrorism, foreign terrorism. But now, the effort now is to get the domestic terrorist operations into that bucket of external funds. Once you open that up, that means that $11 billion, that can go to other issues as well. So it's a backdoor way of enhancing the funding for the FBI without the public awareness, which has been the apple of their eye for a very long time.
So again, this is all about funding, headlines, careers, podcasts. You look at their social media, and again, they're in on all this hipster TikToking culture rather than protecting us from threats. So it's become something that all Americans now recognize every time we have these dangerous attacks. Charlie Kirk assassination, the Brown University business that's still ongoing. Is this a structural problem or a PR problem where they look like buffoons? Basic details are missed. It seems like they're incapable of catching anyone anymore, even though, like, when it comes to January 6th and when it comes to the next iteration of that when Democrats take over, like, you better believe they're going to be able to track everyone down. Why is it when it comes to this that they look like the Keystone Cops?
I think there's a few reasons here. The FBI is not totally incompetent, but it is hyped up to a level of competency in the American people's eye through pop culture, TV, and movies that is just impossible. I mean, I remember when we had the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, having to hear about how the FBI had to investigate a decades-old sexual assault allegation, which wasn't even a federal crime, and they would certainly get to the bottom of it with pixie dust or whatever the presumption was, because that's the American people's expectation, which the FBI is happy to capitalize on because then they get more acclaim and more funding and materiel and personnel, and they grow. But really, they haven't recruited police officers for a very long time. They're overly bloated at a leadership or management level. And could just speak from personal experience. If I was a brick agent working a case and I was in contact with multiple bosses, they couldn't wait to tell me, what do you need? What resources can we send you? But they didn't actually know how to investigate those cases, because people ascending the ladder of management who would be making these call shots here on like a Brown are ill-equipped. They've been investigators for a couple of years, and then they took the test and started promoting. They're just career managers, and they don't have that subject matter expertise. And then you just put it out there, and there's a lot of static between local and federal that I believe we're getting to a point now where it's finally starting to boil over. And this is what I caution Kash Patel about. The FBI has for decades, nigh on decades, stolen credit for the work of local police. The Agent Johnson, no relation scene from Die Hard is very true. It's very reflective of what actually exists. And that static has now gotten on full display, as we're seeing in this Brown investigation. And then you get beyond that these guys are just not really competent investigators, and they're doing what they're predisposed to do always, and that is show of force. Let's create a paper trail or a narrative of, we logged this many man hours, we had this many tools in place, just so they can brag about all the goodies that they brought, and we gave a full showing of our abilities and capabilities for the American people. But ultimately, when it comes to catching a bad guy, they don't do it that often, and that's not their actual directive. If you look at what the FBI is supposed to be, they're supposed to be long-term, complex investigations, public corruption, white collar. They're not cops. Now, if the president and the director of the FBI want to retool it, that's okay. That's their prerogative. But what they're doing right now is square peg into a round hole. There are better ways to make violent crime a priority than taking people who are indoor dogs, cubicle dwellers, on a computer most of the time, not even wearing a firearm on their hip, and saying, go forth and go get the bad guys.
No, because that's what we've seen here, that it's been 3 days. There's 800 cameras in the school. The guy came out blatantly in front of everyone. They even, people say he said certain things. And then now the university is actively scrubbing this page of this Islamist guy there. We don't know. And then we just see videos of them kicking some snow on a lawn. And it's just,
apparently they couldn't get the government rake that they could get from an acquisition for $250 that actually costs the rest of us $10 if we go to Home Depot.
I don't get it. I don't understand what's going on there. There's just no vision. And also, who we know that the type of persona, the profile of a recruit, let's say around 9/11 time. But give us a sense of the type of recruit the last number of years, and has that changed over the last 11 months?
Well, I think the last few years, there's an increased search for intelligence. I mean, even the current administration has bragged about how they have a record number of applicants for intelligence. The FBI is supposed to be a law enforcement agency, but it's a member of the intelligence community, which is it's a tool that doesn't work that way. You should never have, that's a secret police force that has intelligence combined with law enforcement, KGB, Cheka type of stuff. And they've been recruiting people out of colleges, and even the recruiting that's going on right now under the current tenure, Patel and Bongino at the helm there, they're putting out all these advertisements for people saying, are you a doctor? Are you a teacher? You could be an FBI agent. And from my understanding, even in the 1 week that I was pulled back, they're having problems with people because the people who are applying think that they're applying to be a doctor or a teacher at the FBI, not necessarily an agent. But at that point, they're so far along in the process to be hired, the FBI actively encourages them, well, don't you want to be an agent? And then they get these people that have applied under these wrong circumstances that just kind of settle for that, as opposed to recruiting the cops who know how to carry forward investigation, and just giving them a little bit of extra training on how to do FBI paperwork.
Unbelievable. Wow. Wow. So it hasn't changed. And instead, we're lulled into this false sense of security. What about outside the FBI, the broader DOJ? There was supposed to be a weaponization working group. And that, by the way, that was the word of the year in 2024, 2023. You don't hear it so much now. Whatever happened to that working group?
I haven't heard very much. I mean, I'm going to be passing along in the next day or so a letter that kind of regales the weaponization working group members of Congress with what happened to me over the last week, and we'll see if it does anything other than get them to go on cable news and promise to have some hearings and strongly worded letters after the fact. But I think that they just came in and said, "We got our guys, and we're going to assume that everything is okay." And we are seeing now, just through a slew of things, and they've really, the pot's boiled over the last month or so on all of these failures, that is not enough. That was never enough. It had to be total personnel warfare, or they had to do was what my preference was, and that is just padlock the doors, because the American people do not need an FBI. We didn't have one at the founding of the country. We did pretty well. And now we have a robust law enforcement with technology that you're able to communicate across state lines and county lines. And there's fusion centers that are established. And we were assured that we were turning the Hoover building into a museum to the deep state. And instead, I guess that $60 million jet is pretty sweet. Cash Patel is in there flying all over and living the good life.
Yeah, and he loves doing podcasts as well, which is bizarre. Because again, you would think this would be pedal to the metal given everything that's going on. Because that's the funny thing. It's not just a lack of weaponization. It's that once you're not going to defang it, man, there are a lot of threats going on now, more so than in other recent years. The other part of this is you can't have the weaponization with the FBI without a partnership with the prosecutors. So, the US Attorney's Office, one of the things that I've been shocked about is that you have US attorneys. I mean, the one in Maryland is awful, I know, appointed under Trump, either, maintaining from before or even some of the new appointees. And then certainly the assistant US attorneys that do most of the work, they're saturated with these guys. Like I'm pretty sure the Minneapolis office that was responsible for ensuring that not a single guy who burned down the police precinct 3, that police station, got more than 2.5 years. And I believe every one of them is currently out at this point. I don't think any of those prosecutors have been fired. Now, Trump has complained about the blue slip rule, which has encumbered some of the permanent nominees, but you could have acting ones. Why are they still there? And what are you hearing about it? The weaponization on the prosecution side of things.
What people need to understand is that there's an enormous level of discretion within those offices. You could bring a righteous case to them where there's a violation of federal law, and they can just decline it and say, well, we just don't have the resources of the time. You need to take that to a local magistrate to handle that. And that happens regularly. I mean, I've taken human trafficking cases in, and they said, we're not interested. I've taken in violent cases where there was a stabbing, and they responded, how stabbed was he? So just institutionally, there's a lot of discretion there. And then you accompany that with far leftists, and that's my typical experience, that assistant United States attorneys, those are the guys and gals that are going in to try these cases. The U.S. attorney very rarely is in court at all, unless it's a very high profile John Gotti type of case. And even then, they just do an opening statement and leave. It's more of a political appointment. But those frontline prosecutors, they are picking and choosing where they want to go. And you might have an actual righteous FBI that's going out, letting cops be cops and doing the bidding of the American people. All it takes is a declination from a federal prosecutor, and they cannot move the football forward. And that's why you have to have a reassessment of personnel, not just at an FBI, but also within these United States attorney's offices. And it might start with getting the right people at the top of the helm to make those calls. And they've just been slow rolled in there. And here we are in a full year into the Trump administration, and there's a lot of vacancies.
So you get the anarchy, and then you get the potential for tyranny right when Democrats come back. And one of the things that really bothers me about this is that it's going to set us back 4 years, and we're going to be entering the next Democrat administration with this sword over our head without any progress. This is the negative efficacy. So what you're working on under the Biden administration was to try to get states to interpose against this sort of rogue weaponization out of the FBI. And there was an appetite, at least to varying degrees, there's an appetite for it because, oh my gosh, look what Biden's FBI is doing. But describe for us, now that Trump's in, you describe it as meet the new boss, same as the old boss. But because at the end of the day, it's a Republican administration, I'm assuming there's not much of an appetite in the legislatures to issue some reforms to your state and local law enforcement and how they work with the FBI.
That's correct. At a state level, at a local level, even at a grassroots level. I've had the opportunity to speak to lots of different grassroots organizations and regale them with some of the information I'm sharing with you and your audience right now. And they are jaws agape to learn upon that, because they feel like they know Dan and they know Cash. They have this parasocial relationship with guys who don't know they even exist and have never interacted with them, and just presume that everything has gone back to hunky-dory, when it really, in the history of the FBI, it really never was. I mean, you're talking about J. Edgar Hoover, who was going after Martin Luther King, and you had PatCon that was happening in the 90s. I mean, it's a long history of these trails of abuses that have gone on, but it's our team is in charge. We're going to wave pom-poms. And now they've set themselves up for the next administration that comes in. If it's a Gavin Newsom type who takes the reins and turns a teeth on the attack dog back on them, they haven't had any of the institutional change that was necessary, where they should have taken the teeth out. They should have at least deconstructed the structure so they would have to start from the ground up to build the structure to come after you. It hasn't happened. And the last thing I'll add is, people need to realize that the targets, the government gangsters, as Kash Patel labels them, they're never going to prison. And it's not just ineptitude and because they like the status quo and they're not going to do it. So much of what went on there was legal. And it wasn't appropriate, but it was legal. Take Arctic Frost. Everything that was done in Arctic Frost was by the law, by the Constitution, by the policies, the procedures, domestic investigations, operations guides, attorney guidelines for domestic investigations, by further guidance from the Attorney General, Bill Barr. All of it, every jot and tittle was completely legal. It wasn't appropriate, which always goes back to personnel. If there's a bench warrant for you, Daniel, because you had a speeding ticket and didn't show up, there could be a warrant for your arrest. It is completely legal to send a SWAT team to your house, but it's not appropriate. That's why you vet people to have fidelity and bravery and integrity to step up and say, that's not right. We're not going to do that. We're going to use our discretion on this. And that hasn't been done. It's the same people that are there. And they're the people who had their names redacted on the Arctic Frost opening communication.
And again, when we say they're going to pick up with the same machinery, the same infrastructure, if nothing changes, it will often be with the same personnel that were there before, survived Trump, and will be there for Newsom, AOC, Whitmer, who knows? Heck, the Whitmer kidnapping thing, that would be pretty funny if she got in there and ran the FBI. I mean, this whole thing is such a circus. It reminds me of the economy where, you had all these, like, I won't name names, but certain economists that were, they would deconstruct the jobs and inflation numbers under Biden, and he's gaslighting us. And then it comes back now. It's like, suddenly the economy is not a problem. Suddenly the weaponization is not a problem. And it's just dumb. And again, this is going to put us backwards in doing what we need to be doing. And we're going to regret it. We're going to wake up from this drunken stupor. And look, the proof's in the pudding. You're out. And some of these bad guys that were behind January 6th are in. And that says everything you need to know. Steve, thanks so much for what you've done, what you've gone through. I know my audience really, they're concerned about you and, your future. You've sacrificed it all. And what a message to future whistleblowers that unless you get involved in the GOP grift industry, we don't care to pursue justice and righteousness. Micah 6:8. It's all a game. And to you guys, it wasn't. You gave it all. And I suspect we won't be hearing from many other whistleblowers in the future.
No, unfortunately, that's what's happened. I mean, the concerns are never actually addressed. I mean, that was always my concern. I said, look, I'll lay over the barbed wire. I'll take all the slings and arrows. I just want my concerns addressed. They never were. Instead, the politicians exploited it for their own personal gain, and we were removed in mass because we committed the ultimate sin of embarrassing the institution. In this case, it was the FBI, and they will rue that day because no one will ever come forward. But actually, that's probably by design. They don't want anybody, no matter who is in charge. We got to keep the status quo going, and anybody who's willing to stand up and speak truth about what's going on and is out of step with the law, the Constitution, or ethics, or morality is just going to be steamrolled.
But you know what? Those podcasts will be quite lucrative when Gavin Newsom is locking people up and will be like, weaponization, look at this, because it's just all a circular game of listless vessels. And this is the problem when you don't have godly men as prescribed in Exodus, what you're looking for in leaders. It's just a game. For you, it wasn't, and you paid the price. And I know God will reward you either in this world or next world. At Real Steve Friend. And of course, the American Radicals podcast on Rumble. Thanks so much, Steve, and thank you all for listening.